The whispering walls, the arrival and unease. Arthur Finch needed quiet, not the sterile silence of a library or the muted hum of a suburban cul-de-sac, but the profound, undisturbed quiet that allows thoughts to unfurl and words to take shape. His third novel, a sprawling historical epic, had stalled, its characters mute, its plot lines tangled. His agent had suggested a change of scenery. Advertisement for the apartment in the city's old quarter, with its promise of character and seclusion at a suspiciously low rent, had seemed like a lifeline. The building itself was a relic, hunched between two more modern, indifferent structures. Its brickwork was stained with age, its windows dark like vacant eyes. Mr. Henderson, the landlord, a man whose smile didn't quite reach his own eyes, had been brief during the viewing. Previous tenant left rather suddenly, he'd mumbled, gesturing vaguely around the sparsely furnished rooms. Their loss, your gain, eh? The apartment was larger than Arthur had expected, with high ceilings and tall, narrow windows that looked out onto a forgotten alleyway. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light that filtered through the grimy panes. There was a chill in the air that the ancient radiators struggled to dispel. Arthur set up his writing desk in the largest room, a study of sorts, its walls covered in faded, floral wallpaper. He tried to ignore the faint, musty odor that clung to the air, the scent of old paper and something else, something indefinably unsettling. For the first few days, the quiet was almost perfect. The city's roar was a distant murmur, easily ignored. Arthur began to write, the words flowing with a newfound ease. He worked late into the nights, fueled by coffee and the thrill of progress. It was on the fourth night, as the clock on his mantelpiece wheezed its way towards 3 in the morning, that he first heard it. A whisper, so faint, so fleeting, he almost dismissed it as a trick of his tired mind. It was like the rustle of dry leaves or the sigh of wind through a crack in the window frame, yet it seemed to emanate from within the very walls of the study. He paused, his pen hovering over the page, listening. Silence. He shook his head, attributing it to fatigue, and returned to his manuscript. But the whispers returned. Night after night they would begin as he settled down to write, soft and indistinct, a sibilant murmur that slithered at the edges of his hearing. He'd stop, strain his ears, but the moment he focused, they would fade, leaving only the oppressive silence of the old apartment. He checked for drafts, for mice, scrabbling in the wainscoting, for the sounds of neighbors through the thin walls. He found nothing. The building seemed to hold its breath around him. Sleep became a luxury. The whispers, though never loud, were insidious, weaving their way into his dreams, leaving him waking with a start, his heart pounding, a formless dread clinging to him. His work began to suffer. The words that had flowed so easily now felt forced, hollow. The quiet he had craved was now tainted, filled with an unseen, unheard presence that was slowly, inexorably fraying his nerves. The descent. The whispers, once a mere annoyance, began to take on a more sinister character. They were no longer just rustles or sighs, but seemed to hover on the edge of intelligibility. Fragments of words, distorted and drawn out, would snag Arthur's attention, a sibilant tease here, a guttural are there. He'd freeze, straining to decipher them, but they would dissolve back into an infuriating, meaningless murmur, like voices heard underwater or from a vast, echoing distance. His frustration mounted, gnawing at his composure, and a deeper, colder fear began to take root. It wasn't just the sounds. The apartment itself seemed to be subtly changing, or perhaps it was Arthur's perception of it. Objects he was certain he'd left in one place would appear slightly shifted, a book askew on the shelf, a pen rolled to the edge of his desk. He'd find doors he was sure he'd closed now ajar, casting long, unsettling shadows in the dim hallways. A persistent cold spot materialized in his study, near the wall where the whispers seemed most concentrated. It was a damp, unnatural chill that no amount of heat from the clanking radiators could dispel. Standing near it made the hairs on his arms prickle, and a wave of nausea would wash over him. Driven by a growing unease that was rapidly eclipsing his desire for solitude, Arthur decided to investigate the previous tenant. Mr. Henderson, when contacted, was evasive. Just packed up and left, he did. Owed a bit of rent too, the blighter. He offered no forwarding address, no details, his voice tight with a discomfort that Arthur was beginning to understand. He tried the other tenants in the building, a collection of reclusive individuals who seemed to prefer the shadows. Most offered little more than a shrug or a nervous glance, but Mrs. Petrov, an elderly woman on the ground floor with eyes that seemed to see too much, finally offered a sliver of information. Odd fellow, that one, she rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Kept to himself, muttered a lot. Then, just gone, like smoke. Her gaze flickered towards his apartment, a silent, knowing look that sent a shiver down Arthur's spine. The isolation of the apartment, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. The city outside, with its noise and life, seemed a world away. Arthur found himself increasingly confined, his days and nights blurring into a monotonous cycle of strained listening and fitful sleep. He stopped calling friends, stopped answering emails. His novel lay untouched, its pages gathering a fine layer of dust. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger, his face etched with a paranoia he could no longer deny. Was he losing his mind? Were the whispers a figment of his stressed imagination, a symptom of his solitude? Or was there something genuinely malevolent lurking within the fabric of the old building, something that had claimed the previous tenant and was now turning its attention to him? The revelation. One night, the whispers reached a fever pitch. They were no longer a subtle undercurrent but a cacophony of urgent, pleading sounds that seemed to claw at the inside of Arthur's skull. Sleep was impossible. His sanity felt like a fraying rope. He paced the apartment, a wild energy thrumming through him. A desperate need to find the source, to make it stop. The sounds were undeniably strongest in the study, emanating from that one particular section of wall with the faded floral wallpaper, the section that always felt so cold. He stood before it, his breath misting in the unnaturally frigid air. The wallpaper, brittle with age, was peeling slightly at one corner. A sudden, reckless impulse seized him. With trembling fingers, he gripped the loose edge and pulled. It came away with a dry, tearing sound, revealing a patch of older, darker paper beneath. He tore at that too, and then another layer, each one more decayed than the last, like peeling back the skin of some ancient, forgotten thing. Finally, his fingers met the cold, rough surface of bare plaster. He fumbled for the flashlight he'd taken to carrying, its beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom, and then he saw them, scratched into the plaster, almost invisible in the dim light, were lines, marks, words. He leaned closer, his heart hammering against his ribs, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The scratching was crude, desperate, as if gouged into the wall with a fingernail or a sharp stone. He squinted, trying to decipher the faint etchings. The first coherent phrase that leaped out at him sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through his body. "It's me." His blood ran cold. He stumbled back, a choked gasp escaping his lips. He forced himself to look again, to trace the spidery, frantic script. There were more messages, a chaotic jumble of warnings and pleas. "Don't listen. Behind you. Not real. I tried to leave." Each word was a fresh stab of horror, but it wasn't just the content of the messages that terrified him. It was the handwriting. Shaky, distorted by haste and fear, it was nonetheless, unmistakably, undeniably, his own. Arthur stared, his mind reeling, refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. He thought of his own journals, the hurried notes he scribbled for his novel, the slant of the T's, the loop of the G's, the impatient slash of the periods. They were all there, a grotesque parody of his own hand. It was as if a darker, more desperate version of himself had clawed these messages into the wall. The whispers in the room seemed to intensify, swirling around him, and for the first time he could almost understand them. They were echoes of the words on the wall, spoken in a voice that was a distorted, agonized version of his own. The previous tenant hadn't just disappeared, he hadn't just left. Arthur was staring at his legacy, a warning etched in plaster, a testament to a horror he was now inextricably part of. Or perhaps the previous tenant was never a different person at all. The falling action and cyclical resolution. The air in the study grew heavy, thick with an almost tangible malevolence. As Arthur stared at the frantic calligraphy, the whispers in the room sharpened, coalescing into a chillingly familiar chorus. It was his own voice, multiplied, echoing the desperate pleas scratched into the plaster. "It's me, don't listen. Behind you, not real. I tried to leave." Each word resonated deep within him, not as an external sound, but as if originating from his own throat, his own mind. A wave of icy coldness washed over him, far more profound than the chill that had previously clung to that section of the wall. It was a coldness that seeped into his bones, into his very soul. He felt a profound sense of vertigo, as if the floor beneath him had dissolved, leaving him adrift in a timeless, horrifying void. The room, the apartment, seemed to constrict around him, the walls pressing in. He wanted to scream, to run, to break free from the suffocating grip of this impossible reality, but his limbs felt like lead, his will a fragile thing against the immense pressure that bore down on him. He looked at his hands, they were trembling violently. Or were they? A strange detachment settled over him, a horrifying sense of observing his own actions as if from a great distance. His gaze was drawn back to the wall, to a small bare patch of plaster beneath the last scrawled message. An overwhelming compulsion, alien yet terrifyingly intimate, rose within him. He felt his right hand lift, his fingers splaying. He had no sharp object, no tool, but the need to add his own voice, his own warning, or perhaps his own epitaph was irresistible. His fingernails, he realized with a sickening lurch, felt preternaturally hard, almost like claws. He could feel the rough texture of the plaster against his fingertips. He tried to pull his hand back, to fight the unseen force that guided him, but it was like struggling against an ocean current. A low moan escaped his lips, a sound that was both his and not his. Then, with a will that was no longer entirely his own, his fingers began to scratch. The sound was agonizingly loud in the oppressive silence, a dry, rasping counterpoint to the chorus of whispers that now seemed to be celebrating, welcoming him. He didn't know what he wrote. The words flowed from him, gouged into the wall by a hand that moved with a desperate, preordained certainty. When it was over, his fingers were raw, bleeding, the plaster dust caked beneath his nails. He slumped against the wall, his strength utterly gone, the whispers now a soothing, insidious lullaby. Weeks later, Mr. Henderson, his smile still not reaching his eyes, showed the apartment to a young woman, a musician seeking a quiet space to compose. The study walls were freshly papered, a cheerful, innocuous floral pattern. Previous tenant left rather suddenly, Mr. Henderson said, his voice betraying nothing. Bit of a writer. "I think, couldn't handle the solitude, I suppose." The young woman ran a hand over the new wallpaper. "It's very quiet," she observed, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Perfect." As she stood in the center of the room, imagining her piano in the corner, a faint, almost imperceptible draft seemed to stir the air. Had she listened closely, very closely, she might have heard it, the faintest of whispers, like dry leaves skittering across an old, forgotten page, just beginning to stir within the walls.